Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Encounter with a Fake Cop by Happy Cream Cheese. This story happened when I was about 13 or 14. I grew up in a town with a lot of walking and biking trails and forest area about a 10-minute walk from my house, so I spent a lot of time outside. One of my best friends, I'll call him Anthony, lived in the neighborhood across from mine, and I would frequently walk to his house to knock on his door and see whether he wanted to join me in biking aimlessly around town. On this particular day, he decided to join me, and we went down to the local lake, an extremely popular spot during summer. I mean, it's never empty. There's a trail right next to the local library which leads to the lake. We decided to hang out by the trail entrance as it was right next to a tunnel that ran under the street above, providing good shade and amplification for listening to music together off our iPods. This tunnel is probably a good 20 feet long or so, with the only easy path back up to the street above being the paved one on one side. The trail itself is gravel, with trees on both sides, no easy way to get off the bike unless you use the designated entrances and exits. Anthony and I were hanging out on the opposite side of the tunnel from the trail entrance, so as to not bother any families getting on the trail with our music. We had our bikes leaned up the side of the tunnel when I noticed a man coming through the opposite end, right next to the trail entrance. He entered the tunnel, and once he was about 15 feet away, called out, "I'm a city name here, police officer." It didn't take more than a 2-second glance to tell that he wasn't. He was wearing cargo shorts, a green tank top, sandals, and a big military-style backpack. Even from about 15 feet away, I could tell that his skin looked really greasy, and his hair was unkempt. I immediately knew something bad was about to happen, and my adrenaline started to rush. I turned to my friend and just yelled at him, "Anthony, run!" To which he got on his bike and began to ride off. The man was standing between us and the trail entrance, so there was no easy way for us to take off without either needing to go directly past him or down the trail in the opposite direction. Anthony chose to try for the main entrance that the man was blocking. As he rode past, the man reached out and grabbed his arm, and Anthony sort of stopped. But the man was more focused on me and ended up letting go, to which Anthony quickly took off. I knew I wouldn't be as lucky as Anthony if I tried to push my way past the man, so I immediately started looking for other ways to run. I noticed that there was actually a small dirt trail on the same end of the tunnel that we had been. I tried to take my bike up it, and the man yelled out behind me, "Didn't your parents ever teach you to not run from the fucking cops?" The trail grew too small for me to carry my bike down, so I just dropped it on the ground and continued running, hoping that this side trail led back up to the street where at least he wouldn't be able to hurt me without witnesses. He chased me about halfway down the trail, but eventually turned around. I ended up coming out at the library and quickly ran to the top of the tunnel so that I could see what he was doing. All I saw was him riding off on my bike. I called the cops, and they came to my house to give me a lineup after I walked home. I instantly identified the guy. Apparently, he and his twin brother were homeless and on meth, which would explain his demeanor and motivation. They were well known for stealing bikes in the area, but never so brazenly. I was just glad that the situation wasn't worse, because based on his substance abuse, he very easily could have chosen violence at the drop of a hat. A Skinwalker by Busy Consideration 298. So one fine day, I got a text from my friends. "It's a good rainy day. Let's go to a waterfall nearby." Where did they get this energy to climb a hill when it's raining this heavy? Why can't they just enjoy a nice cup of tea or coffee and a playlist? Oh well, either way, there was no point in denying, because they would drag me out of my house anyway. So we decided to set out in the evening, and I had a great place in mind. We reached there around 5:30 p.m. Even though I had planned to laze around in my room, Witnessing such a scene of a mountain covered with a blanket of fog and distance view of a waterfall was worth the trip. It was less to no crowd as it was a weekday. When we started climbing, it took 4 of us around 15 or 20 minutes to reach the waterfall, and the view up there of the city was mesmerizing. There was a very small area surrounded by big rocks at the summit of the waterfall. The flow had created hot spring-style potholes, one below another. There were a few people up there, around 4 or 5 except us, and as the waterfall was loud, it was hard to communicate without yelling. We're the kind of group who just enjoys the company of each other, even though there was no conversation going on. We all sat in one of those potholes in silence, just vibing with the feeling of the flowing water, the enchanting view, and the sound of the falls was bliss. We all drifted off. After some time passed by, I was lost in thoughts, just admiring the view. I noticed a small broken branch of white flower flowing beside me. I watched it flow down one pothole to another, and it was peaceful watching it flow until it finally went out of view in thick forest. That's when I jolted out of my daydream. I looked back wondering what my friends were up to, and they were all still drifting off on their own. One was laying down enjoying the flow, and the other was sky-gazing. But I started noticing something strange. It was quite too quiet. I couldn't hear people talking or laughing as before, and I looked back and I realized the place was deserted. We were the only ones left behind. When I checked my watch, it made me feel uneasy, because when we came here and sat down, it was around 6 or 6:15. Everyone, including me, had thought we had spent maybe 15 minutes idling there. There was a 45-minute time gap we couldn't explain. When I told them it's almost 7 o'clock, they all thought I was joking, but after confirming they had confused yet blank looks on their faces and didn't know what to make out of the situation. At the moment, we decided to not overthink it and decided to descend as it was getting dark. Whatever luck we had, the sunset was late that day. As we started our way down with the chit-chat, I was still bugged about the fact that all 4 of us were sitting there ideally for almost an hour and none of us noticed, and how we hadn't noticed other people leaving. As I was overflowing with these thoughts, I heard a whistling sound coming from the edge of the forest of the trail we were walking. To give you a clear idea of the trail, it was a narrow path on the edge of a hill, and down below was a slide of deep forestation. I looked at my friends to see if anyone had heard the whistle too, but they all seemed to be busy with their conversation. I shrugged it off as maybe a bird, and as I continued a few steps down, I heard it again. A whistle, kind of which sounded very human. I watched my friends walking in front of me as they all looked in the same direction as the sound came from down the edge. First, when we heard the whistle, it sounded casual, but as we paced further, the tone changed and sounded way more like it wanted our attention. The conversation between them was slowly dying down as they were starting to realize what the situation was. I also noticed the whistling was coming from the same distance, even though we were moving as if whatever was making that sound was maintaining the same 5 to 10 meters distance between us. Well, to say it clearly, it was following us. And I guess everyone with me had to start to realize this without me saying anything. Now, the thing about late-time sunset is, it lights the sky as long as it does, and in a matter of minutes is dark as the middle of night. It seemed our luck had run out on us. We were almost out of the forest area, but it was pitch dark, and we were at the mercy of our phone's flashlights, and slippery, muddy trails were of not any help to our pace. I was walking up front because some turns needed a support hand to pass by. And as we were almost out of this forest, I was starting to feel a little hopeful, if I had only known that this was just a false feeling. Then something happened which none of us had expected. The sound of a branch breaking, followed by a whistle that sent a chill down everyone's spine. My heart was racing faster than ever. I looked back and everyone was frozen in their tracks like deer in headlights. I wanted to flash my light towards the direction of the sound, but something screamed inside of me to leave it alone. Somehow calming myself, I decided to check on my friends. 2 of them were holding on somehow, but the one who was walking in last She had tears in her eyes, almost ready to give up and scream her lungs out for help. Honestly, she would have if she wasn't paralyzed by fear. I could sense she or none of them wanted to be the last person standing. I knew everyone, including me, just wanted to run like hell, but that would have only led to some serious casualties as the path was filled with sharp stones. I mustered up whatever hope I had left to not panic and walked all the way back, tapped on her shoulder, signaling her to move forward while joking on how she was slowing us down. In my mind, I was begging that they would go along with me and not cause a scene, and for the sake of that they did, laughing awkwardly on the joke, and began pacing forward. All life on Earth, including humans, animals, birds, and even insects, share one thing in their DNA, and that's instinct, a necessity for survival. At that moment, not out of fear, but something else inside us was telling us that something was lurking in that slope of thick forest. The slope was nearly impossible to stand or walk through for any normal human. Somehow we all knew. We absolutely could not acknowledge the whistle, or that there was something in those bushes. After what felt like forever, we managed to get out of the forest, and we rushed forwards towards our bikes and took off as fast as we could. Coming into the city, the sound of traffic and the lights were calming us down, and I noticed we were all shivering of cold and maybe fear. I made a stop at a tea stall, and the warmth of tea was soothing as time passed and the fear was starting to fade away. Curiosity took its place, and we started brainstorming on what actually happened to us. Were we just scared of random noises? Was our brain messing with us out of fear? Many theories and logical reasoning can be created out of it, and we came up with the best theory, that it could have been a bird that mimics humans. Sounds reasonable, right? After all, some crows and parrots can basically have conversations, so how hard could it be to just whistle? We all shrugged it off. As days passed, it still didn't fit right with me, so I decided to do some research about that place. Like what kind of birds and animals are found in the area. To my surprise, there were none of the birds native that could mimic sounds, and it's also supposed to be a hunting ground for kites. So birds smaller in size tend to avoid the area, which threw parrot theory out of the equation. As I went down the rabbit hole, I found something that made my blood cold and made matters much worse. Apparently, there were several cases of suicides and accidental deaths of many men, women, and children, some of which the bodies were never found. Police officers always sealed the entrance with barricades during heavy rainy days, but some locals always managed to slip past and had met with unfortunate accidents. I couldn't find any stories similar to ours, but then again, this spot was not known to many and was only known to locals. As I'm documenting this down, to this day I have no explanation to what could have happened to us that day. A ghost? Or something out of a folklore like Skinwalkers? Or maybe a mind game of fear? I leave that to your imagination. Coworker Who Killed His Dad by NoNet4610. Before I tell this story, I'd like to say this. I used to be a trash poster on this platform, but this story is true. When I was 18, I used to work in a grocery store as a cashier. I got along pretty well with most of my coworkers, and we used to take lunches together in the break room because there was only one big table for everyone to be seated. Everyone would talk to everyone except for this guy. Let's call him Jeff. Jeff was a butcher at our store. He wasn't mean to anyone. He wasn't weird or anything. I used to think he was more shy because he never talked to anyone other than the other people in his department. Sometimes, though, when people would tell jokes, he would smile, laugh a little, so I guess he just didn't want to be disrupted. And he just wasn't really a friendly person. I used to be a supervisor when this story happened. And one night I came to work to close the store. I went upstairs first, then went to clock in and talk with my manager to see how everything was going before starting my shift. When I went into her office, the first thing she told me was something along the line of, "If the radio calls, say you don't know anything. Don't answer their questions. Don't get involved." I was genuinely confused about what was going on. I'd just arrived and already it was implied that there was something big going on. I had no idea what the fuck was happening. Eventually, she told me that someone in the store was accused of murder. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. At that moment, I had no idea what had happened. I ended up figuring out it was Jeff with the conversations going around. Basically, Jeff lost it the night before. He killed his father, who was a retired policeman. He attacked him with a katana. The media also revealed that a few years prior to that, his brother and he had been involved in sexual assault stories. The most disturbing part to me was that I kind of worked with him the day before. The guy ended up being found not guilty because they determined he was psychotic the night that it happened. Not Wanted by The Friendly Fiend. So, a much-needed disclaimer first. English isn't my first language. I'm Italian. So apologies in advance for any grammatical horror I may end up giving birth to while typing this down. This happened in the summer of 2007. It was told to me by the two girls who experienced it, who were friends of mine at the time. And also a couple. That's important for later. It all happened in central Italy, in Lazio, the region where Rome is. And I need to give some context about it. The area around Rome is full of hills. Most of that region is. And underneath many of these hills sit ancient Roman pre-Christian catacombs. So many, in fact, that they're not even that big of a deal for the locals. And some of the catacombs have even gotten converted into wine cellars or basements over the centuries. Some haven't. Again, this is important for later. Now, these two girls, I'll call E and C, were in their early 20s, had been together for a year or so back then, and given how ludicrously expensive rents are in Rome, decided to try their luck finding a flat in one of the small towns around that area, on those hills I've mentioned. Mind you, those hills aren't ominous at all. If you've ever seen pictures from Tuscany, that's what they look like, which is rather lovely. And they did find a small apartment for rent in one of those towns. A renovated flat on the second floor of a much older house, which isn't surprising at all in that region, as many houses are centuries old and just get renovated from time to time. On the ground floor of that apartment there were some neighbors, but they never got to see too much of them. A couple of apartments with old people living in them. There was also a very old, sturdy wooden door, which was always closed and locked with a padlock. And when they asked the landlord where it led, he told them it was the door to some old cellar nobody really used anymore, and supposedly was connected to one of the catacombs I've mentioned earlier. Again, it's an ancient country, and such things don't come across as particularly weird to us. Neither did it to E and C, who just shrugged it off like, okay, makes sense. So E and C spent a few months in that town, not really bonding with anyone, mainly commuting from there to Rome and back to work, for C, and studying, for E. However, being a homosexual couple in an old town full of old and bigoted people, they quickly started noticing how unwelcome they really were there. They'd go to the local store to buy food, and the clerk would ignore them on purpose. They'd find their mailbox emptied and all of their mail scattered over the floor outside of their apartment. They'd even bump into people riding scooters around town, passing them by and yelling, "Goddamn lesbians!" In short, they didn't have the best time there. But they knew it was only a temporary solution, so they decided to just endure it, all the while waiting to move again. And yes, FYI, Italy is still majorly conservative on the topic of LGBTQ. Even more so now than 16 years ago. Then, one morning, as she was stepping outside to go to the car and drive to Rome, E found something on the ground right in front of their flat's door. A mussel shell had been placed there, with a doused red candle in it, and judging by the mess it made and how short the candle was by now, it had been burning for the whole night. Not knowing what to do with it, she picked up the shell with the candle and threw it in the garbage, together with all the wax she could scoop up from the floor. Another thing she noticed when she finally set out to leave was that the door, the sturdy wooden door downstairs that had always been closed up to at that point, wasn't locked anymore. The padlock was gone, and it was open just a crack. But she didn't really pay much attention to it right then. But then things started happening. At first it was an uneasy feeling. E and C would be in their living room sitting on the couch, reading, chatting, watching a movie. and suddenly they'd have this feeling like someone was watching them. Later on, it became more than that. They'd hear noises around the house, like someone knocking on the walls in another room, or the toilet flushing on its own, water taps turning on by themselves in the kitchen. Quickly, it became less than bearable. One night as they were sleeping, they both woke up in the middle of the night hearing the footsteps of bare feet in their living room. They started listening. It felt like the footsteps were simply pacing around, and there was nothing else. No voices, no items being moved, just the sound of bare feet in their living room. After a while, C, feeling understandably scared, whispered, "What's that?" to E. And as she did, the footsteps stopped, as if noticing her voice in the silence of the apartment. They stopped, and a split second later they started sprinting towards their bedroom. E grabbed C and turned her face away from the door, doing so herself, just moments before the footsteps came through their bedroom door and stopped at the side of the bed. "Don't look. Whatever happens now, don't look," E told C, and held her in her arms for the rest of the night, neither of them sleeping. Just listening for those footsteps to finally leave, or whoever it was to do something, anything at all. But nothing happened. They spent the next 3 hours wide awake in silence until dawn came, and with that bit of sunlight finally shining through, E found the courage to turn around, and nothing was there. Another night E, who was in university at the time, was up late studying in their living room as C was sleeping. Like I said before, it was summer and the window in the living room was open. She wasn't facing it. The window was to her left as she was sitting at the table taking notes. Suddenly, she felt the hair at the back of her head stand, and had that familiar feeling of being watched, so she instinctively turned to the window. She described what she saw as a completely pitch-black human-like figure perched on the windowsill, with no features on its face save for 2 very large orange glowing eyes, and the figure just stood there motionless and stared at me. She couldn't tell me for how long she stared at it. She told me she felt completely paralyzed. She told me she felt completely paralyzed and helpless, and had the feeling that, had she tried to move or do anything, that thing would have lunged at her. Eventually, she couldn't hold it anymore, turned around and closed her eyes, took a long deep breath and looked again, and it was gone. After that, they contacted their landlord and decided to leave for good. They did so within a week since that event, and the last thing E noticed as they were finishing packing their things up and leaving was that the big wooden door, the one that had been left open ever since all of these events had begun, was now once again closed and locked shut with a padlock. It's been 14 years since I was told all of this, and ever since then I've never shared it outside of conversations with a few trusted friends. I had been meaning to write it down eventually, but never got around to it until now. And no, sadly, I don't know the name of the town where all this happened. I'm not in touch with E and C anymore, so I couldn't find out even if I wanted to. But knowing myself and what a massive dumbass I can be, I don't much mind not knowing, because I know I'd be tempted to go and take a look on my own, and that doesn't sound like it'd lead anywhere constructive. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification bell for updates as I do so. Follow me on social media. All of the links to that are in the description below. And if you'd like to take your support even further, find me on Patreon. A link to that is in the description below as well, as is my storefront on tpublic.com. Get yourself some Uncle Josh True Scary Stories merch. Anything you do supports the channel, big or small. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.